No one truly accomplishes anything alone. When we study wars or the rise of empires, we see these great characters. We see Charlemagne, we see Julius Caesar, Scipio Africanus. All characters that, of course, had a team of officers around them, people who helped. And yet, there's a reason why we don't know them too much. With Julius Caesar we know some. We know Antony, of course, but we know him mostly for what he will do after Caesar died. We can do deep dives, trying to understand how Caesar could never have conquered Gaul without this guy or this other guy. But there is a character in Roman history, the character in a certain sense, the guy who changed everything, who cannot be studied without his team. We could consider him, as a joke of course, the inventor of the startup. A squad of young people incredibly talented who see the world in a new way and are capable to destabilize social structures, political structures, economical structures. The startup we're talking about is Gaius Octavius, better known as Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus, first emperor of Rome. He was born on the 23rd of September 63 BC, the same year Cicero would crush the Catilinarian conspiracy, and Pompey returned triumphant from the east. Rome was restless, violent, shifting. The Republic, though not yet dead, was showing signs of terminal illness. Class conflict, erosion of norms, and political violence were becoming permanent fixtures. Into this world came Gaius Octavius Turinus, a boy of uncertain health but potent ancestry. His father, Gaius Octavius, was a novus homo, a new man like Marius, who had risen from the plebeian nobility of Velitrae to become a praetor and a governor in Macedonia. But it was through his mother, Attia Balba Caesonia, that young Octavian was connected to real power. Attia was Julius Caesar's niece. This made Caesar the boy's great-uncle, and eventually something more. Octavian's early physical condition is well documented by Suetonius in the life of Augustus. He writes, "He was unusually handsome and exceedingly graceful at all periods of his life, yet he was not strong in body, and throughout his life he suffered from various complaints. He could not easily bear heat or cold." Suetonius details numerous ailments, skin lesions, stiffness of joints, insomnia, chronic fatigue, sensitivity to climate, yet this weakness seems only to have sharpened the boy's mind. The Roman virtus often viewed physical frailty as incompatible with leadership, but Octavian would overturn that prejudice entirely. Here, we should pause. Suetonius wrote over a century after Augustus' death, under the reign of Hadrian. His lives of the Caesars are gossipy, moralizing, and often shaped by posthumous imperial ideology. So, while we can take his list of ailments seriously, as they are consistent with Roman medical knowledge, his characterization must be read as shaped by retrospective awe. Augustus, the sickly boy who became master of the world, was a tidy narrative arc for later writers. But let's go on. According to Nicholas of Damascus, a friend and biographer of Augustus, Octavian showed leadership even as a boy, organizing groups of children into mock armies and games of trials and judgments. He was sent to study in Apollonia, in Illyria, this around 45 BC, alongside other young Roman nobles. Among his companions was Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, a fellow student and rising star from a modest background. While in Apollonia, Octavian had access to Caesar's veterans and military commanders. According to Appian, the young man was likely already being groomed for higher roles. He was given direct insight into military logistics and trained in political power, despite being only 17. But then the world shattered. On March 15, 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated in the Senate. The news reached Octavian outside Dyrrachium, the the same place where the Battle of the Walls was fought between Caesar and Pompey. With his great uncle dead, Rome plunged into uncertainty. But Octavian's response was immediate and astonishing. Rather than staying safe in the east, he set sail for Italy. According to Appian in Civil Wars and Plutarch in the Life of Caesar, Caesar's will named Octavian, not Antony, not any other senator, as principal heir. He was to inherit Caesar's name, legacy, and most shockingly, his vast fortune of 75 million sesterces, alongside gifts to the people of Rome. This will was public, legally binding, but the implications were seismic. Octavian was now Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, the filius adoptivus, adoptive son, of the most powerful man Rome had ever seen. But with that came danger. The Senate feared Caesar's cult of personality. The assassins, Brutus, Cassius, Decimus, had fled, but their sympathizers remained. Worse, Mark Antony, Caesar's surviving co-consul and right-hand man, had in his hands the entire Caesarian party. It's important to recognize that only a handful of sources mention the exact context of Caesar's will, and all of them are post facto. We do not possess the document itself. Much of what we know comes through Appian and Suetonius, both writing with hindsight, under emperors who wanted to portray Octavian's succession as divinely ordained and politically valid. Yet, the speed and conviction with which Octavian acted strongly suggests that the will was real and legally persuasive. The Senate may have resisted him at first, but there was a value in names. Caesar was already a god for a lot of people in Rome and would become a god in 2 years after his assassination. And Octavian would become the son of a god. But before he was divinized, he was already the son of Caesar. Now, already during his return from Illyria, Octavian was consulting with Marcus Agrippa, whose military aptitude and unwavering loyalty would become fundamental to everything that followed. Agrippa had no political pedigree, but he had a talent for strategy and an absolute willingness to serve. The first half of the startup. As Velleius Paterculus put it in his Roman history, Agrippa was obedient to no one but Octavian. With him, an idea was implemented as soon as it was thought of. Also, hovering in the early background was another guy, Gaius Maecenas. After all, as in Game of Thrones, the dragon has 3 heads. Maecenas was an Etruscan aristocrat, a young one, known for his deep connections in Rome cultural elite. While not yet Octavian full propagandist, Maecenas was already part of the circle forming around the young Heir, the other half of the startup. Not courtiers, but a team, designed for war, power, and legitimacy. This modern political machine, a term used by modern historian Ronald Sim, is one of the most remarkable features of Octavian's rise. Unlike Caesar or Pompey, Octavian did not rely on personal charisma or battlefield brilliance. He relied on structure. And think about it, Rome always relied on structure. Rome did it from the times of the early Republic. Augustus, Octavian, was Rome in a certain sense. When he arrived in Rome, Octavian was unarmed, untested, and, in the eyes of Antony and the Senate, unimportant. He had no official title, he had no military experience, he had only the name. But as he quietly began taking meetings, paying off veterans and rallying ambitious allies, well, let's let Cassius Dio say it. Even at that age, he had a shrewdness beyond his years. He observed much and revealed little. It was dangerous to underestimate him. When Octavian arrived in Italy in April of 44 BC, he was 18. The world he stepped into was chaos draped in togas. Julius Caesar was dead, and Rome was in a fever. The Senate, far from welcoming his heir, was divided, terrified and already being manipulated by a man who thought himself the natural successor of Caesar's power, Mark Antony. Octavian came ashore near Brindisium with a single legion to his name. His great-uncle, assassins, had fled eastward, but in Rome, Antony had taken control of Caesar's papers, Caesar's residence, and Caesar's political capital. Suetonius tells us that Octavian was warned not to return at all, that Antony might kill him, or that he would be manipulated and used by others. He came anyway, and did it with gifts. Octavian began distributing parts of Caesar's promised inheritance to the Roman people from his own purse. Even though Antony controlled the estate, Appian describes the move as a calculated stroke. He collected as much money as he could from his own and his friends, and with it, he paid Caesar's bequest to the people. This action could have destroyed him, but it transformed him in the eyes of Rome. The boy who paid Caesar's debts was more Caesar than Caesar's old general who hoarded the funds. He acted like Caesar. The political genius of the gesture is hard to overstate. Without holding a single office, Octavian had begun to speak not only in Caesar's name, but as Caesar's voice. He understood Caesar's ethos, much more than Mark Antony ever could. But the maneuver did not go unnoticed. Mark Antony, consul and war veteran, initially dismissed the boy as naive, referring to him contemptuously as a child. In Plutarch's Life of Antony, we read that Antony warned others, "This is a boy to be praised and honored, but not to be feared." This would prove to be one of the most catastrophic misjudgments, maybe in human history. Antony had expected to inherit the political structure Caesar had left behind, if not legally, then in practice. He retained the consulship, command of troops, and possession of Caesar's files and documents. By denying Octavian access to these, including the actual will, Antony tried to maintain control of the Caesarian faction. Suetonius even claims that Antony attempted to keep the will suppressed entirely, but once it was made public, and Octavian legally assumed the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, the public tide began to shift. To understand how deep Caesar's name was circulating in the veins of Rome, coins bearing the new name of Octavianus began circulating in 43 BC, and even before he held a magistracy, he was using his image to stake a claim to legitimacy. This was because of Caesar. Now, ancient historians see Octavian as a torch of justice, a man who comes back to Rome to burn it and make it anew. Some kind of a proto-god, in a sense. But modern historians see him as a very cold and calculating operator. This reading is reinforced by the strategy Octavian used. He did not seek power through standard Republican channels, nor did he openly challenge Antony. Not yet. Instead, he moved among the veterans distributing money and gradually took over Caesar's client network, one favor at a time. He also began cultivating men of talent, positioning himself as the nucleus of a new kind of faction. In this period, Agrippa reappears as more than a companion. He was helping organize support among Caesar's old legions. Octavian was already surrounding himself with doers rather than talkers. He was building something long-term. And it was a different thing than what came before. There was no respect in Octavian for the structure of the Republic. Why? Because that structure had killed Caesar. That structure had destroyed his life in a sense. He was so probably happy being able to study and grow up normally, knowing that power was waiting for him with Caesar. Now, slowly, the balance of power with Antony was beginning to shift. Antony was increasingly embattled. He had turned much of the Senate against him by bullying, stalling, and overstepping his constitutional bound. Cicero, who had initially dismissed Octavian, now saw an opportunity. In his Philippics, a series of speeches aimed at demolishing Antony's reputation, Cicero began praising Octavian as a savior of the Republic. "You, young man, have acted like an old and wise consul. Antony like a tyrant drunk on power. This was a major gamble. Octavian had no official position, but Cicero helped the Senate give him imperium propretore, command authority, in order to counter Antony, who was marching north toward Cisalpine Gaul to confront Decimus Brutus. Decimus was another one of the generals of Caesar, but one who betrayed him. Octavian finally had power, and he played the part flawlessly. He accepted the command with apparent humility, marched north, and joined forces with the senatorial legions. His confrontation with Antony at Mutina in April 43 BC, a bloody battle that cost both consuls their lives, was a turning point. Though the Senate tried to reassert control over the victory, Octavian now commanded a real army, an army that Agrippa was immediately able to wield like a sword. The Senate had a plan of how things were gonna go. After the victory, they were gonna elect one of them as new consul and begin re-establishing the Republic. Cassius Dio writes of what happened next. He did not rage or threaten, but said only this, that he would not allow himself to be mocked. Octavian calmly turned his army south and marched on Rome. The Senate, panicked and leaderless, gave in immediately. Octavian was elected consul at the age of 19, unprecedented in Roman history. He immediately passed laws validating Caesar's adoption and all of his own actions to date. He was now legally Caesar's son, not just by will, and he was about to become much more. But let's stop for a second and focus on our startup. Octavian may have inherited Caesar's name, wealth, and political capital, but his rise was not a solo act, as we said at the beginning of this video. From the very start, he surrounded himself with men of extraordinary ability, with which he formed a two-way street of loyalty. He was loyal to them just as they were loyal to him. They were a package deal, very different from the situation that others had had before. Marcus Agrippa was at the core of the Octavian operation. When the news of Caesar's assassination arrived, Suetonius suggests that it was Agrippa to urge Octavian to act immediately and seize his inheritance. That moment, on foreign soil with the Republic collapsing behind them, marks not just the start of Octavian's political career, but the creation of the team. Agrippa wasn't merely a general, he was a second brain. A logistics master, a strategist who anticipated problems before they arose and solved them without grandstanding. In every campaign, Octavian would later fight against Antony, against Sextus Pompey, and eventually against Cleopatra. Agrippa was not just present, he was at the center of the operation. It is worth emphasizing that Agrippa's rise was extraordinary in Roman terms. He had no senatorial ancestry, and no base for inherited power. Yet Octavian placed him on a level above generals like Lepidus, commanders like Decimus Brutus. This was new. This was modern. This was functional loyalty over family name. And that alone marked the death of the old republic. If Agrippa was the arm, Gaius Maecenas, Mecenate to us Italians, was the soul. He had wealth, style, and a razor-sharp political instinct. Tacitus later describes him as effeminate and luxurious in private, but lethally efficient in politics. And that contrast seems entirely intentional. He never held consulship or military command, yet his influence at court was vast. Maecenas' strength lay in diplomacy, cultural messaging, and urban management. He was Octavian's emissary during the internal negotiations, especially in moments when war threatened to fracture Rome from within. Cassius Dio tells us he was sent as an emissary to Antony more than once, helping navigate the fragile balance that would eventually become the Second Triumvirate. I think I have pronounced Maecenas, Maecenas, Mecenate in 100 different ways, so I will now start using Maecenas. That seems to be the most English pronunciation. Sorry for the confusion, that's the Italian in me coming out. So going back to Cassius Dio, Maecenas, a man of great shrewdness and caution, was entrusted with the gravest matters, and acted as proxy for Caesar when Rome could not tolerate his absence. End quote. More than that, Maecenas began shaping Octavian public image in the late 40s BC. There was a fascinating marketing job being done by Maecenas. While Antony was associated with Dionysus, revelry, and martial glory, Octavian, through Maecenas himself, began aligning with Apollo, order, light, and civic virtue. After all, Octavian didn't need to be a glorious general, a glorious commander. He had one. He had Agrippa. So he could be something more, something higher, something divine. That would later manifest in temples, poetry, and religious reforms, but the roots were already present by the 43-42 BC. The idea was simple. Antony might promise victory, but Octavian promised peace. The former offered charisma, the latter stability. Mecenate skillfully used what we could consider praise to Antony in order to aggrandize Octavian. And here is where the difference between the Republic and the Empire becomes visible. The Republic was a system of aristocratic dominance and chaotic compromise, a king of the hill game training the best of the best to conquer everything. What Octavian was building, through Agrippa's armies and Maecenas' messaging, was a regime, a sustainable framework for rule, designed to outlast the man himself. Yet, from a historiographical standpoint, we must be cautious. While Maecenas is lauded in later imperial histories, we hear little about him from contemporaries like Cicero. That silence may reflect a real absence, or it may indicate the secrecy of his role. The Augustan poets, like Virgil or Horace, all praise him as their patron, and that cultural patronage often eclipses his political importance in modern summaries. But the consistent mentions in Dio and Suetonius suggests that behind closed doors, Maecenas was one of Octavian's most trusted operators. It's just not necessarily as public as one would think when you read history. Agrippa, by contrast, has left behind very little personal trace. No letters survive, no speeches, no memories. His presence is documented almost entirely through third-party narratives. Appian credits him with crucial victories, Suetonius records him receiving triumphs, but as an individual, Agrippa remains quiet, a man defined by action, not rhetoric. There's a certain beauty in that. This triangle, Octavian, Agrippa, and Maecenas, was not just a political alliance, but a functional innovation. Caesar had depended on alliances too, but they were always uneasy and often treacherous. Crassus, Pompey, Curio, and later Antony were rivals as much as allies. Octavian's inner circle, by contrast, was deliberately cultivated for loyalty and function. These men were not chosen for wealth or popularity, they were chosen to win and stay together. But what about the other side? What about the other protagonist of the Caesarian party? The only party in Rome right now, since the opposition had fled, mainly, at least the main characters. Marcus Antonius, better known to history as Mark Antony, was no newcomer to power. We have talked about him plenty during this time we have spent looking at Octavian. Now, let's take a look at Antony himself. He had fought with Caesar in Gaul, ended the civil war, served as master of the horse during Caesar's dictatorship, and stood by him almost to the very end. When Caesar died, Antony was consul, meaning that Caesar trusted him to work with him. This meant to many that he was the true heir of Caesar. Now, Antony was a soldier, he was a general, he really wasn't a politician. And so, at the beginning of his reign in Rome, after Caesar died, well, Antony made mistakes. He allowed the conspirators to go free while ratifying all of Caesar's decrees. This was a shrewd move, one that temporarily stabilized Rome, but it is ironic that after using the hatred of the people for those who hurt Caesar, he underestimated how much the people loved Caesar, because they were furious. This created a political vacuum since Antony was not the representative they really wanted. He let them go. The assassins. That is the vacuum that Octavian was now using. Antony's reaction to Octavian's arrival was dismissive, as we said. Plutarch reports that he refused even to meet the young man at first. When he did, the meeting went poorly. Antony expected deference. Octavian expected access to Caesar's documents and funds. Instead, Antony withheld everything: the will, the treasury, and personal papers. While being a capable commander and a charismatic speaker, even if Cicero would have us think of him as kind of a beast, Antony was governed by instinct much more than calculation. Plutarch portrays him as charismatic and generous, but impulsive and vain. Cassius Dio is less forgiving, often describing him as arrogant and short-tempered. Suetonius, writing under the imperial system, the one erected on the body of Antony, offers a backhanded compliment. He had strength of body and boldness of spirit, but no patience, no forethought. Now, consider this. You can see in all of these descriptions that while having something good to say about Antony, everything Octavian is, Antony is not. Now, we can just believe it, and it forms a beautiful narrative, of course, or we can consider this a part of Maecenas' work to create characters, to create a narrative, a beautiful story where two opposites collide. After all, this image of a gifted soldier undone by temperament is a common trope in Roman historiography. But it is important to recognize that Antony in 44 BC had very real assets. He commanded loyalty from many Caesarian veterans, had the legal authority of the consulship. He also knew how to rally a crowd and work the plebs. Now, we only have the history we have, of course. I'm just pointing out that many historians had a reason to color him the way they do. But in the end, even after trying to underline the problems with the historiography, I do believe Antony was more similar to his historical image than not. Why? Because we have a primary source, a beautiful one at that. One written by the hands of the best writer and speaker of the time. Now, don't get me wrong, he hated. But when you write for a public who knows Antony, you have to tell the truth. You embellish it, right? You do not attack someone with just blatant lies, you enrich his darker side. And that is what happens in the Philippics of Cicero. Cicero, great politician and a man who had opposed Caesar, was pardoned and was now living in Rome under the Caesarian party. He was a secondary figure now, but still people remembered who he was, the great lawyer, the great speaker, and he was ready to rise up again now that Octavian was around, because he had an alternative to Antony, who he hated with a passion. And so he rose up, writing the Philippics, a series of speeches where he burns Mark Antony to the ground. 14 speeches, to be precise. The model was structured after the speeches of Demosthenes against Philip of Macedon. Caesar launched in them a relentless rhetorical campaign to cast Antony as the new tyrant, the new Catiline, the new Caesar. Catiline was the guy who tried to take over Rome and was stopped by Cicero himself, so there is a little bit of self-aggrandizement there. Octavian, by contrast, was cast as the boy who would save the Republic. So considering that in the Philippics Cicero accuses Antony of political corruption, opportunism, and even compares him to a prostitute, considering he creates this parallel with Catiline, a notorious traitor, well, we can think that while Cicero must be exaggerating, probably the various negative traits we find in Mark Antony in the other historians must have a base in reality. So coming finally back to our timeline, Octavian just triumphed against Antony at Mutina. He requested the consulship, and when he was denied, or at least the Senate tried to deny him, he forced through with his army. The ghost of Caesar still dominated politics, as the assassins, the conspirators, were still out there, in the east, gathering forces, preparing to try and retake the city. They represented the noble, conservative side of Rome, while the Caesarian party was now split, with Antony defeated, marching north, and Octavian marching on Rome. And here, destiny comes into the picture. During this time, the Octavian startup was moving on Antony on all sides, especially culturally. They were painting him as a corrupt version of Caesar, as a bad alternative in general. And in 44 BC, Octavian gave the people the Ludi Victoriae Caesaris, a series of beautiful public games in honor of Caesar. During these games, something happened that we can actually verify today. A comet appeared in the sky. Octavian seized the moment, declaring it the Sidus Iulium, the star of Julius Caesar, Caesar's soul ascending to the heavens. We today are able to verify that a comet was visible at the time, strengthening the case that this event was genuine. Antony, meanwhile, was facing setbacks. After being declared a public enemy by the Senate, he retreated across the Alps to join Lepidus, another Caesarian general who controlled several legions in Gaul and Hispania. Their alliance was shaky but essential. Antony needed numbers, and Lepidus, ever a political survivor, needed relevance. This convergence triggered a shift. By autumn 43 BC, Antony and Lepidus controlled a formidable military force in Gaul. Octavian, having taken Rome by force and secured the consulship, knew he couldn't face them alone. The Senate, of course, was pinning him against Antony, but Octavian would flip the script. Instead of fighting, he opened negotiations with Antony and Lepidus to formalize their power. Here begins one of the most cynical episodes in Roman political history. The three men, each stained by civil war and betrayal, met personally near Bononia, out on an island on the Reno River. They finally had a chance to speak, with Antony having to take Octavian seriously now, and they hashed out a deal. The Second Triumvirate. Now, we know the Second Triumvirate as the imitation of the first, the one between Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, but in truth, the first one was a private deal, something that wasn't publicized and didn't have the name First Triumvirate. Of course, first wouldn't be the name it would have had, but the Triumvirate wasn't really a name used. It became used posthumously as the first after the second was created and named. Now, this alliance was not born of trust. It was a necessity. Rome had no clear ruler, no functioning constitution, and three men who each claimed the right to fix it. It also had external threats, mainly from the conspirators who could return, maybe. This deal sidelined the Senate completely. It was the final strike at the Senate power. While the first triumvirate was created to dominate the Senate, the second was created to sideline it. Now, in order to formalize the Second Triumvirate as the ruling organization of Rome, they needed a law. This law was passed through Comitia Tributa, the popular assembly. The Senate didn't vote on it, the people did. It was the Lex Titia, named after the tribune Publius Titus, who introduced it. The law text survives only in fragments, but enough is preserved by later references to reconstruct its core elements. It established a formal commission of three men, Triumvirate Publicae Constituende, three men for the reconstitution of the state. They would hold extraordinary powers for 5 years, renewable, and they were immune to all persecution. Their authority included the right to propose and enforce laws without Senate approval, the right to nominate all magistrates, the right to command armies across the Republic, the right to override any existing law, precedent, or veto new law. This conglomeration of power was more comprehensive than Caesar's own dictator perpetuo. They held more power than Caesar himself. Now, before we move on to the last chapter of this first half of the rise of Augustus, let me explain to you why this lex, this law, was passed. I mean, why people wanted it. Because they did. They weren't forced. People were tired. They were exhausted. Think about it. We are in 43 BC. Sulla occupied Rome militarily around 82-83 BC. So, in 40 years, you had the civil war between Sulla and the Marian party. You had the proscriptions. You had the problems with the pirates, you had Pompey coming back with half of the world's wealth, you had Crassus and his army disappearing in the east in Parthia, you had Pompey against Caesar. You had the conquest of Gaul, you had so much war, so much wealth and devastation, and of course wealth is good, right? But it creates instability. All of this money, all of these riches coming back to Rome in only 40 years completely remade Rome. This is why you see all of these characters springing up all the time because of all this money going around. You see new people, new families, new organizations. Stability has gone to hell. And if there's something people love, it's stability. We want to live our life without too much of a hassle. We want to just be left alone. And now, looking in the eyes of a new civil war, the people said, no thank you. Just rule. Just do it. I don't care about republican institutions. I don't care. Just rule and be at peace. Of course, the Second Triumvirate would not stop a new civil war. We will have our final confrontation, but in the end, the man who got the favor of the people, the man who in the end won, both militarily and in the hearts of the Romans, was Apollo. Stability, not Dionysus, charisma and new adventure. Frankly, by giving a very quick analysis of the Lex Titia, you can immediately see that it has deep gashes in it. There is no review mechanism, no court oversight. There is no way they can balance each other out other than vetoing each other, which is not great for stability. Yet it worked for a while. We can find coins with the triumvirates there representing stability as the saviors of Rome. Temples were refurbished to show this new power to the people. The Ludi Victoriae Caesaris were held again, reinforcing divine sanction. Agrippa, meanwhile, began building projects that subtly rewrote the urban space, new forums, porticos, and altars that recast Rome as the capital of a righteous new age, separating it from the past. Behind this, of course, was violence. This violence expressed itself in two ways, externally and internally. Externally, there was the problem of Brutus and Cassius, the assassins of Caesar. They had gathered the last great Republican army. They controlled the eastern provinces, had the loyalty of provincial governors, and they were raising money and troops at a staggering rate. With them were men of senatorial authority and Republican faith, the final hope for the old system. And they were not just resisting, they were preparing to invade. Many in Rome hoped they would, Cicero among them. He had hoped that the Republican cause could prevail in the Senate and in Italy. But the battle would be fought in the fields of Greece. But the three rulers of Rome knew that unity was required for victory, and unity would be taken with blood. This was the internal front. Before leaving for war, they made one last decisive move. They recreated the proscriptions. The Republic had seen such purges before, most notably under Sulla. But what followed in 43 BC was something different in both scale and psychology. Each triumvir submitted a list of enemies to be killed and their property confiscated. At first, they hesitated to include friends and relatives, but that restraint crumbled quickly. Plutarch reports that Octavian allowed Antony to add Cicero to the list in exchange for sparing Octavian's own allies. They were playing a chess game. The famous anecdote that Octavian wept before signing Cicero's death warrant may be true, but it changes nothing. In total, 300 senators and 2,000 equites were killed or outlawed. Cicero's head and his right hand, the hand used to write the Philippics, were nailed to the speaker's platform. It was the end of Republican oratory. From now on, power spoke with legions, not words. And yet, the bloodletting served a purpose beyond vengeance: money. The Eastern campaign would be ruinously expensive, and the proscriptions founded it. Ancient sources emphasize the scale of confiscated wealth. Cassius Dio notes that many innocents were killed simply to claim their estates. Modern scholars, like Eric Gruen, note that while Sulla's proscriptions may have been political cleansing, these were administrative, targeted, rationalized, and aimed at financing war. It wasn't a frenzy, it was budget. With Italy pacified, the triumvirs turned east. Now this video is already long enough to go into details about the campaign, so we will jump to the Battle of Philippi in October 42 BC, the final battle of the campaign. Our sources are vivid and contradictory about them. Appian describes Antony as a hero, charging personally into the fray, rallying troops, saving the center, while he describes Octavian hiding in a swamp during the first day of fighting, a charge repeated by both Suetonius and Plutarch. Suetonius says Octavian was ill. Plutarch implies cowardice. Modern historians tend to split the difference. Octavian was unwell, but also likely untested in open combat. Regardless, it was Antony who won Philippi. He destroyed Cassius' position on the first day. Brutus, left alone, held out until the second battle, then committed suicide when the legions broke. The Republic died with him. Antony buried Brutus with honors. Octavian did not attend the funeral. He remained in camp, consolidating control, executing prisoners, and preparing to return to Italy. As usual, a cold, calculating Octavian and an instinctual Antony. And so the table was ready for the great game. The great game between Antony and Octavian, with Lepidus becoming more and more irrelevant, partly by choice because he was a survivor. He just wanted to survive, he didn't want to rule. The Republic was dead, and Rome would be ruled by someone. And that someone would be decided on the battlefield, both of politics and of military action. The result would be the ascension of a new person, the three-headed dragon of Augustus. I'll see you soon. Have a good one.